welcome to Module 3 and Flow of Control. So this module, I'm hoping that most of the information in this module you are already familiar with and it's just a review, but let's get started. So let's take these notes here and talk a little bit about the notes, and then we'll also do some code examples. So flow of control are just ways that you change the flow of your program. So if you use conditions or loops, you're going to change the way that your program flows. It's not just going to flow from top to bottom. It's going to have changes in its flow. So the way that you do the changes is you test conditions or you test expressions. So as a reminder of what an expression is just a combination of variables and operations that yield a value. So mathematical expressions is just a combination of literal values and variables, but at the end of that expression, you're going to have a result. And the same thing is true for a Boolean expression, except a Boolean expression, the result has only two different values, either false or true. So let's talk about the different ways you can change the flow of your program. So the first two ways, if, else, and switch, they just change it one time. So you go through your program, you do a test. If that's true, then you change the flow, or you do switch, you test your values, etc. The other ways to change the flow of your program is by using loops. The three different types of loops are while loops, do while loops, and for loops. So this is the same as C. There's not a big difference here, but there are some things that we can add on for C++. So we will be talking about that and doing some examples. But this is a good time for you to get caught up on your practice, because moving forward, we are going to be adding a lot of new features very soon. Order of precedence. Order of precedence is important. You need to make sure that you are aware of what's going to be tested and what has the highest priority. So at the top here, these operators have the highest priority, and the logical and logical ors have the lowest priority. So if you're ever in doubt or you're not sure, you can always use parentheses to make sure that you are testing what you are expecting. Now with logical ands and logical ors, a logical and is a full Boolean expression, but it is made up of two expressions, at least two. So with a logical and, you have to have full expressions on each side of your logical and. With a logical or, you need to have full expressions on each side of your logical or. It's very important that you are aware of that. Like if you wanted to test if x is greater than 10 and x is less than 20, you can't say if x is greater than 10 and 20. That's not how it works. You have to have a full expression on each side. And in order for a logical and to be true, both expressions must be true. And for a logical or to be true, there's three different ways it can be true. The only way for a logical or to be false are if both expressions are false. Not. You can almost always avoid using not. Not can become confusing. Certainly you can use it, but you want to make sure that you are testing for what you're going to get the results that you're after. Something that we didn't use, at least in my intro to C class, are enumerated types. So enumerated types allow you to declare use words for values in your program. It makes your code much more interesting. And if you do not specify values by assigning them values, so for example, I could assign, instead of using the number 31, I could use the word January length. Everywhere in my program where it says January length, it would be the number 31. If I don't use an assignment in my enumerated type, then it goes in order and starts with 0. So if I was going to use an enumerated type for the months, of course, we start January as month 1, so this would do month 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now if you go on to Canvas here, I just want to point out, in the Instructional Materials section, I do have notes, and I have tons of sample code. And I personally feel that the best way to learn to program is to practice. Read code and practice. So I've already started by putting this first code example right here, enumerated types, into my compiler, and I'm going to test and see what happens. So I've already done this for you. I've taken the code, typed it up, and given you working code. I have also added something here. In C, we used to do like this, pound define summer, months, whatever, 3. You don't use that in C++. In C++, you actually declare a global constant variable. In our class, we will not be declaring global variables, but you can declare global constants. A global constant is different than a global variable because a constant doesn't change. All we're doing up here is we're saying, I want to use this word summer months, and everywhere that I use summer months in my program, it will have the value of 3. So you need to look at how this is done. This is very different than doing like pound define pi 3.14, and this is the C++ way to do it. And here's how you do enumerated types. We have month, this is the same from the notes, and we have the month placement as well. And then here, if you notice, so these have been placed in here. And so right here, everywhere it has summer months, that will have a 3. Where it has June, that will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. June length is 30. So let's test it and see what happens. All right, so see, June is month 6 and has 30 days. There are 3 months in summer. And I encourage you to take these examples that I give you and not only just put them in your compiler, but read them and look at them and try things and change things and practice. Because, again, the best way to learn to code is to practice, which you will also be doing through your programming assignments. All right, let's get back to our notes here. Branching. So branching, of course, you have already hopefully done this, used if, else if, and else. So this is called a cascading else if. I encourage you when you are doing this to use curly braces for a block of code. So right here, this is a Boolean condition. So if you have a variable called hours and it's true that that variable is less than or equal to 20, you will go into this block of code and do whatever it says in this block of code, and then it will ignore the rest. Okay? So here I have omitted the curly braces because if you have only one statement, you do not need to put the curly braces. But say, for example, if I left this curly brace off right here, then this cout right here would not belong to that if. So you have to be very careful that you understand how to structure your conditions. I think it's best to just put curly braces. That way later, if you want to add something, you can add it. In addition, you want to make sure you don't have a dangling else problem. So if you don't pair your if-else's up and use good style and use curly braces when necessary, you could end up with some else that will be paired with the wrong if. So be very careful with that. And I did take this code and I can put it in my compiler and go through it and test it. So if we take a look at it, this is the same that's in your notes. So we're going to have the user enter the rate of pay. We're going to have the user enter the hours. If the hours are less than or equal to 20, then this is what we're going to do. Else, if the hours are less than or equal to 40, then this is what we're going to do. So if it ends up that the hours are more than 40, this is a local block of code that belongs to that else. So it will do this test right here, and it will print this onto the screen. So if ours is 66, it will print that onto the screen. If ours is 64, it will not print that onto the screen. But as long as ours is more than 40, that's our last else, it will do everything that is inside of this block of code. All right, this is the magic formula. We already went over this in the last module. This is how you set to 2 decimal places for a double. In this class, I'm going to reiterate that I encourage you to please use the convention and use double in this class. Don't use float, use int, double, and char. That's just a convention, but I prefer that in my classes. And you can take this code, put it in your compiler, try different things, and see what happens. And this is available right here on Canvas. So you have your notes that I'm reading, and then this section of code that's in your notes that's explaining 2 things, making sure that your cascaded if-elses are aligned properly, and also demonstrating a nested if. And then if you want to test it and practice, the code is there, and put it in your compiler and test it. Let's make sure that it works. And we'll put in a number. I'm going to put in a 66. My rate of pay is $15.50 per hour. And I worked 66 hours. So it says you worked way too much, and then it does the calculation, and etc. So I encourage you, this is working code, but don't just put it in your compiler and say, oh yeah, look at that. Put it in your compiler, read it. If you understand this, then you move on to the next thing. Everything builds throughout programming, as you hopefully are aware, and hopefully everything that I've gone over so far is so far right here, except maybe for the enumerated types, but everything to do with the if-else and cascaded if-else is, and you had it in your program 1 as well, that this is review. So I also wanted to show you that I have added a flowchart here with conditions. Oh, I've already downloaded it. Oh, that's right. So just to review, this is review for you, reviewing conditions. And you can take a look at this. So here, this is just the reminders of the operators. These are Boolean expressions. So it says conditional expression, but it's Boolean. If it's true, you go into the block of code. If you have only one single statement, you are not required to include the curly braces, but if you look how nice it looks to include the curly braces, and then it's very clear, and you will not end up with a dangling else problem. So these are the flowchart shapes. You start, input and output, process, and decision. And I just put a few very simple examples here for you. Here's just an if, you check. Here's an if else. Oops. So here's an if. I like to put this just to make sure that you realize that it's possible to just put an if. I know that most of you know that, but just a reminder, you do not always have to have an else every time you have an if. And here's an example that has an else. So this would be if amount is equal to 12. Yes, it is. If it's not, you do something else, and then you meet up down here. This one, you meet up before, so that means that this is only an if. And here's another example. You get the grade. This is just you test if it's less than 60. And this is just an example to show you with a flowchart to help you review using if else. And here is an example of a switch. So when you're doing any of my programming assignments, I don't care if you use if else or you use switch, but switch can only be used if you have an exact value. So in this example, we have a range grade less than 60, grade less than 70. So since you have a range, you would not be using switch. In this example right here, you have a case where it's exactly 100, it's exactly 90, it's exactly 85, etc. So in those situations, you would use switch. I also have added here in the notes, here is another example of a switch on a grade, but this is a character instead of an integer. I want to also point out that in my class, I don't really like students to use break statements in loops. I like you to practice making your loops using a initialization, a test, and an update. A test and an update to break out of your loops with an update, not a break statement. But in switch, you need to use a break statement. And what a break statement does is it breaks out of the curly braces. So this right here is a block of code. This block of code for the switch begins here and ends here. So when you hit the break statement, it will break out of that block of code. Now, another thing that's important to remember about block of codes is that anything inside, if you declare any variables, so this is another block of code, if I were to declare a variable inside of this block of code, then that variable would only be available to that block of code. So you cannot, when you declare a variable like this hours variable is available to all of these conditions because it was declared before we started our conditions. But if I were to declare a variable inside of here, then like gross pay, that would only be available if it was here. Now in this case, in the example, the gross pay has been declared before I start my conditions. But if I were to declare a variable in here like int my or double my pay, that variable my pay, so just for example, if I wanted to go in here and say my pay equals 100, this variable my pay, this block of code does not know what my pay is because my pay only belongs to that block of code. So these are the kind of things that I encourage you to try in these samples that I give you. Read about it and then think about it, and if there's something you think you want to try, then try it. You can't ruin the code that's already there. You can always re-download it from the Canvas. All right, in the next video, I'm going to talk about loops.